Welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. My name is Michael LeBlanc, and I am your host. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. The one and only Kristina Rogers, Global EY Consumer Chairwoman, is back on the podcast with the latest powerful insights from her 13th Future Consumer Index report. Climate change is becoming a growing reality for people worldwide, disrupting ingrained consumption habits. If you think COVID-19 shocked consumer behavior, brace yourself for what happens next. Let's listen in now. Kristina, welcome back to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great. I am looking forward to a fantastic 2024.
Yeah, fantastic. And listen, thanks again. I think one more appearance on the pod and you get like a smoking jacket or something.
Well, good. We'll have to meet in person for that then. Maybe I'll ask for dinner too.
That's funny, right? We first met, you and I, back in Vancouver at a big consumer brand conference. And then, of course, COVID. But we've kept in touch. You've both been on a guest here on The Voice of Retail. You've been a guest on Remarkable Retail. We love, Steve and I love the work you're doing. So thank you so much for coming back. And so excited to get an update on the latest Rev and the latest insights. So once again, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I really enjoy both of those podcasts. So please do keep up the good work. Great guests with really fantastic insights and just fun conversation. So, delighted to be part of it.
Fantastic. Well, all right. So let's not assume that everybody has heard our prior interviews or who knows you or knows enough about you. So spend a minute about who you are and what you do for a living.
So I will, state my position and then try to explain what that means. I am the global consumer leader at EY, formerly known back in the day as Ernst & Young. And my role is really to kind of think about the future. So I and the team cover three specific sectors: retail, consumer products, and food and agriculture. Mm-hmm. And the goal really is to think around the world, what are the trends, where are the future what is the future of those industries? What do our clients need to be thinking about? What do us as EY need to be thinking about in terms of the people we have, the capabilities we have to work with our clients so that they are able to think ahead and win in the marketplace? And so, it's a fantastic role. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to really be forward thinking about just the industries, where consumers are going, and how our clients need to be thinking about their own business to win and meet that future head on.
Now, and for additional information for our listeners, you are based in Chicago, right? Still based in Chicago, is that right?
I am still based in Chicago. Mm-hmm.
Global mandate. You've traveled the world. You've been based all over the place, but your roots, your home is here in Canada, right?
Yep. I grew up in London, Ontario, and went to Queen's as an undergrad. And after that, just sort of ended up, unfortunately never going home. Maybe that will be in my future.
And let's talk about EY for a second. So everybody listening would know the letters or the words, but maybe they don't know the full scope and scale, particularly of your side of the business, the consulting advisory side of the business. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, and EY. So way back in the day, and I think people do still refer to EY as Ernst & Young, and probably that is, the more associated with the tax and audit work that we do. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But the firm is truly a sprawling organization. We have nearly 400,000 employees in over 150 countries. Imagine that. I mean, it's just when I think about that, that's crazy. 700 offices around the world.
So you got to be careful to not hit reply all, I guess, in your
Yes, do not hit reply all. No, but absolutely. And, it's truly incredible to think about the work we do. Obviously, our clients, certainly the clients I work with, particularly in the consumer products space, if you think about some of the giants in that industry, they are in all of the countries where we are. So they need services of some sort, whether it's tax and accounting or strategic advisory, thinking about growth strategy work, corporate strategy, divestitures, acquisitions. And so, my world is really thinking about what are our clients trying to do in all of these places, and is EY configured appropriately? And, more recently, I would say in the past couple of years, we too have been on the push forward to that area of sustainability and reporting, ESG reporting, and real strategy development and investment in that space with our clients.
So over the years, literally years, you've been sharing your Future Consumer Index and the insights and this project with us, and we're here to talk about the latest rev. But why don't we start at the foundation? So tell us a little bit about As I understand it, the index was kind of developed when the COVID hit, and it's like, oh, there's a lot of really dramatic changes happening. Let's get ahead of that, or let's understand it. And then now it's kind of taken on a new role. Not that we're exactly past COVID, but as a COVID era, it's passed. Take a minute and tell us about the tradecraft and the process, the scope and scale of the index itself before we kind of dive into the latest findings.
Well, you would remember, and any of us would remember, my kids too. April 2020 brought something new to us.
Yeah.
We can remember that date. Our lives changed dramatically. It was the start of the pandemic, and in our, at least my world specifically, and all of the shutdowns, and everything was closed: schools, work, restaurants, businesses, everything. So it was pretty clear to me we wanted to track those changes and really understand what new habits might form out of some of those changes. We didn't know how long all of it would last,
So
and track that to really understand, what's changing, what are consumers noticing in this dramatic difference in their lives. And so now we've, had 13 rounds of this research, and we're looking at consumers in 28 countries. And as you said, originally it was really to think about, pandemic-oriented behaviors. Of course, there was a lot of content and data around health and how people were thinking about shopping, and we moved online so quickly for those of us who hadn't been online. But now, we've really repurposed a lot of what we've been doing. We're still tracking some of that, but clearly over the last couple of years, we're more interested in behaviors and sentiment around inflation, or sentiment around, new technologies that are upon us, and certainly looking at sentiments and behaviors around sustainability, climate change, and people thinking more about their waste and their contribution to landfills and that sort of thing. We're getting a lot of good data around that.
Well, and it's a good segue into talking about the latest research, because as you say, talking about sustainability and climate change is on our mind. We're just kind of rolling out of the whatever that COP28 got us for all that kind of stuff. And I guess, in many ways, climate change is a bigger challenge to us, longer risk challenge, and potentially a longer range changer of consumer behaviors than even the COVID era was. COVID was short, sharp, and intense. Climate change is big and arguably a bigger threat, or not arguably, but a different threat. And so, we're all wondering, what on earth are consumers thinking? They're impacted whether they know it or not, large or small ways, from the cost of the food to the safety of their food, and when they shop for apparel. So many questions. It's a great survey. So take us through at a high level what your findings were when talking to consumers about climate change and their behaviors, their shopping behaviors, willingly, or I guess in some ways unwillingly, right?
Right. Well, and I think, over the few times I've been a guest here, we've talked a bit around, some of this did start in a way, the more, I guess, obvious things when you sat at home and you realized how much stuff you had around. Right. So we've talked about that in the past. I've just, you were at home, you were doing everything at home, and you realized your house was filled with things that you really don't need. And I think we saw that early on in some of the research where people said, well, my home is filled with things that I don't want. I'm sad that it's going to a landfill, but I don't I don't want any of this stuff anymore. And there's been a real sort of conscious effort and thought in some of the research we've seen about just consumption in general. But this time around, when we really dug into the topics of sustainability or circularity or what's happening and climate change, there was a lot of very direct responses related to that. So if you can imagine, this research was done at the end of September, early October, and consumers were coming off of, some pretty devastating climate events that we saw, over the previous probably 5 or 6 months. And
there was literally couldn't see, given the fires from Canada that made their way down to the States.
I mean, we had that smoke in Chicago coming, and that it'd be like, where's this from? Oh, it's from this part of Canada, and that, right? And so besides just our environment, there were many more associations made, in our news, in places where we got information that talked about various droughts or flooding or things that were wiping out crops. And despite inflation still hanging around and being like a bad part of our household budget, I think what we saw in this round of research is that consumers were much more willing to make the association of, climate issues and climate events, weather events, to the price of goods. And you made the point, food, certainly food. I mean, there was a lot of association with, the price of things related to droughts, flooding, and just not enough to go around type of thing. And certainly, related to clothing as well. I mean, people start to realize, hey, our clothing comes from somewhere. Sometimes that's cotton, right? And that also is affected by weather events. And so I think there was a slow awakening to the cost of these weather events to our basic daily needs. And then in certain places, as you probably know, Michael, maybe it was more in the US than other places, but there were a lot of insurance companies, over the summer and into the fall that started to say, we're not insuring in certain jurisdictions. Yeah. We can't afford that anymore. There's too many climate events. And so I think consumers, whether it's just their daily needs or bigger need, like something like insurance costs for their homes or what have you, started to really associate some of these events to the cost of goods and to the cost of things that they were bringing into their homes.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. I think for 2023, it for many, climate change became somehow more real and more in front of them. And I'm looking at your survey now, and I'll put a link in the show notes because it's great work. Change the foods I eat because of availability or cost issues. It turns out to be the number one thing people have had to do and think about. I also think about food safety, right? We've just gone through a cantaloupe issue here where 7 Canadians have died from eating cantaloupe that really comes down to climate because the way they're finding water for these balls of poison, as I've kind of described them. I mean, like, this is, people need to start, I think many consumers, and your research kind of validates, are starting to connect the dots around these things, right? I think
they're starting to connect the dots to, especially food and the cost of food, and trying to understand some of that. And then certainly safety issues, that's really devastating what you just said. I think the other thing that has, and I mentioned just people thinking, I've got too much stuff. What do I do with all this? I don't need it. I don't want it. So there's the issue of the daily consumables, like our food and our beverage needs and that sort of thing. And then there are just, I was having a look at the research recently, and, even with regards to landfill and circularity, I mean, you have about 40% of global respondents saying they want to spend less to help the environment. And there were a couple of, areas where this was really predominant. So fashion accessories topped the list because they kind of have become throwaway, right? They've become disposable items, almost consumables. And so I think people are reconsidering that somehow. That's a pretty significant number, 40% of respondents globally, wanting to think about, hey, do I need this? Why don't I repurpose some things I already have? Yeah. And then, that was also noted for toys and electronic gadgets. So people starting to connect the dots, like, do I really need the latest and greatest when I know this is just going to be disposed of and sit somewhere or shipped somewhere, as we're all learning now?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because I want to go down a thread of what people say and what people do and
correct. Kind of that's also good.
Index that by demographic or generation, because if you think about the China factory direct model, where you might as well be shipping it direct to a landfill, they are the number one or number two downloaded apps in America and Canada right now. So and when I've talked to folks like yourself about, okay, how do we square this contradiction? It is clearly around money and generations. It's like, I'd love to do better for the environment and make those decisions and buy the product that lasts longer, but I just don't have the money. So I'll buy from Shein or Temu. So how do you think, as people, start to get their heads around the affordability of making environmentally friendly choices, how do you think that, and you do some of this work in generation, do it by generation or demographic, speak to that for a little bit and does this translate into a drop of overall consumption as a way to address the issue? But I think it's more nuanced than that. Yeah.
I think it is nuanced. I mean, I think there's certain, you're right, certain segments of the population and then certain generations who are looking around and saying, I don't need all of the things I thought I needed. I don't need to
Hmm.
respond to marketing or, demand creation or what have you. And you're right. I think younger consumers, I think they really need to have a look at themselves. We see this in our research too. I mean, there's that action and intention gap. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I intend to, I'm very,
Hmm.
keen to, do things that are good for the environment. I want my, world to exist in the future. I'm, big on climate change and I don't want to throw things in the landfill. But then the action is just not there. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, we're not just our research, Michael, but
Hmm.
we're seeing
Hmm.
that in other places too. And so whether that's because I can't afford to invest in something that's better quality and keep around, or look, I need to post on Instagram or somewhere
Right.
else all the time, so I need to
Right.
be seeing it in something different. Whatever that
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
I don't.
Mm.
It's unclear,
Mm.
but I think you're right. There's that action and intention gap, and that changes, frankly, with older generations that
Mm.
maybe are less, vocal or less agitated about some of the things that are going on, but they're actually the ones that tend to, actually make some lifestyle changes, whether
Hmm.
that's, figuring out how to compost or buying different products or even bringing a reusable grocery bag to a store. There's just a willingness to take the action.
Mm.
So maybe
Yeah.
older generations don't talk about their
Yeah.
intentions
Yeah.
as much or
Yeah.
signal that as much, but they
Mm.
actually take some action. And so
Or
I
have
would,
action. It's interesting. I'm just following that thread. Or have action thrust upon them. I was talking with the folks at LCBO, who Liquor Board in
yep.
Canada, for those international listeners, and they've eliminated not only plastic bags, which they did before, but they now eliminated paper bags. So when you go into an LCBO store, which is massive, bring your own. Like
Right. If
there's
you're
no choice.
planning to buy a lot, bring your own.
Well, they'll give you a case or something. But
They'll
if
give
you're
you a
looking,
box,
they'll
right?
give you a box. But and they're not a singular example. Many retailers have phased out plastic bags and more than encourage you. So some of it is thrust upon them, and it kind of gets me into a segue into how retailers are thinking about all this and reacting, because you work on both the brand and the retail side, which is what's
I
so
do. Yep.
fascinating. And it's funny. I noticed the number one, just back to consumers taking action. The number two thing must have warmed the hearts of some of the brands, had to purchase bottled water. Okay, that's good. It's not really good, but it's good for some of the brands that
If you're
may
selling bottled water, sure.
sell bottled water. But let's talk more globally. Like when you present this to your clients on the brand side or the retail side, what are their reactions? Because they've got, I speak to them. They've got some very talented people in the sustainability and that file, as they would say, very senior roles in all the retailers and I'm sure in the brands, and they're all working on this. What do they make of what you're telling them?
Well, I think they're smart. I mean, they understand that despite there's this big bulge of people, whether it's millennials or Gen Z, that are kind of upon and virtue signaling all the things they want to do, but maybe can't afford it or too lazy, or they want the immediate delivery, or whatever the thing is that doesn't really vibe with their intentions. Retailers know that they're on the front line. So if they are private label or own brand, or they've got to have a clean supply, they've got to be working towards a clean supply chain, and they've got to be sorting through the data, reporting, to provide the right information to their customers. Because the one thing that we do know about consumers is that while they say a lot of things and they want a lot of things, they're a bit lazy and they expect that information to be provided to them. So I feel like we've seen over time, Michael, doing this research, that there is a trend toward, real desire to either buy less, buy better, or, be more conscious, make better choices. Now, maybe the actions aren't there right now, but the trend that I see in the research we do is there for so many reasons, whether it was COVID or inflation, or now I'm more aware of climate change. And, it is a trend, and there will be a tipping point where people will gravitate. So retailers just need to be ready, and they're on the front line. I mean, that's where people expect to get the information. They expect to be presented with good options and good choices, and they want that to be easy. So from one, on the perspective there, I mean, the burden really is on the retailers, certainly grocery. And I would imagine certainly certainly, clothing,
apparel
apparel
coming
anytime
after.
soon.
I mean, that's
right?
that's a big the apparel. I was presenting at a conference, and one of the questions from the audience was, what about sustainability, and can I, it really, the question circulated around table stakes versus differentiators, and it has being, or can you win on these foundation of sustainability and circular reality in your retail when you've got competitors who are not winning on that at all? They're winning on a bunch of other things. So, like, what do you think about this table stakes versus differentiators? Is it all now just a table stake? You've got to know this stuff, and you can't really win, or it's hard to differentiate yourself. What do you think of that?
I think in the longer term or medium term, let's say, it will be table stakes. I do think now there's value. I mean, as much as I'm sort of saying our younger generations are not taking action despite their best intentions, there are segments of the population who value that, and they will gravitate to those places. I mean, those are the generations that are huge on vintage, right, and subscriptions, and they're trying their way to repurpose things. So there
But
is
we should
something
dimensionalize what huge means, though. I mean, when you look at some of the startups, the disruptor startups in that space, they're really small.
They're small. I think it's you're right. It's more the kind of vintage people love, that sort of shopping. But I think in the medium term, this will be table stakes. I think you're right, Michael. I mean, everyone's got to be, there will be so much exposed about some of probably the very disturbing ways in which some of our clothing comes to us, and accessories and fashion and what have you, that I think eventually that will have to change, right?
Yeah.
So it will be stable stakes. But I think there's probably some value in, if you are going for a certain segment of the population, or your consumers are willing to pay more, and you're comfortable with that part of the population, you don't want to be fully mass. I do believe the trend that we're seeing shows you that there's an opportunity there.
I can think of retailers like in Canada, MEC, or in the US, Patagonia, that makes a winning proposition out of doing what you describe.
Right. So there's a template there. So for others who know they have to go in that direction, there's some places to go have a look and say, how are you doing that? How expensive is that? How can we do it? What do we have to change in our operating model to make this happen?
Now, you work in, as you said, EY, very big company doing all kinds of different research. So I wonder if you comment a little bit on the broader context of priorities for retailers and brands. I mean, when I talk to retailers, they bring up things like cybercrime, which there's been many significant attacks in Canada and the U.S. So they got a lot to deal with, right? They got, how do you balance off the priorities of climate change and all these other, let's frame them as risks? What are you hearing from retailers about how they're shifting and investing and making this a priority?
Yeah, and to be honest, Michael, I mean, despite the fact we're just coming off of COP28 at the end of last year, and so on, and we've got kind of this great consumer demand and new regulatory environment in different parts of the world, especially Europe, I do feel like there's been an easing off of the focus on sustainability or climate initiatives at our clients. I think that's tough when the ROI is out in the future. So what we were just talking about, right? And certainly the business client for so many companies has been really challenging, right? They're dealing with all sorts of things, as you say, whether it's cyber issues or exploring use cases for Gen AI or talent management, especially in retail. I mean, there's such a challenge on the talent front, supply chain issues that we've all heard about, and so on. And so I think companies and retailers know that regulation and consumer expectation with regards to circularity or sustainability or energy transition is only going to grow, and they can't really take their foot off the pedal for long on this topic. I do notice less conversation about it, I have to say.
Interesting. Well, it's always been the case in my career that economics, to some degree, dictates environmental issues. Right? There's this, there's a spectrum of consumers and businesses. And if we think about consumers, some consumers make all their decisions based on, let's say, climate-based priorities, and some make it only if it's very, very convenient and it doesn't cost me anything. And there's that spectrum, and economics moves that bullet point or that bubble around a little bit. Let's move as we kind of wrap up to advice. So What are you telling your clients about understanding and acting on this research? And is there different advice for brands and retailers? If you had 3 things you could end with in terms of advice for all the listeners, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd come back to something maybe I said already. Retailers are on the front line. I mean, that's just the fact. And so they've got to continue working on, if it's their own brands or if, if it's private label or if it's an own branded retailer, they've got to keep working on, pushing on that clean supply chain, pushing on understanding where their data comes from, how to report it, provide the right information to regulatory bodies, certainly in Europe, and their customers. Because, right, as we said, despite it all, consumers are lazy. They want these things, but they also want it provided. And so I think the creative retailers and the ones who are, really having a look at how they can do this and get it right, will win. I mean, the burden is clearly on retailers.
And
I
keep
think.
telling the story is what I
Yes,
also would call out of that.
right.
It's like all the time you're investing in telling the story of what you're doing is what time well spent.
Absolutely. Michael, I remember when I lived in Europe, there was a European retailer, which I learned later in life was the largest purchaser of organic cotton. I never would have known that being in their stores.
Right.
But I might have appreciated it. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there's got to be that messaging, in the right place with the right people, and push this forward. I think that, if you think about the medium and the longer term, as we said, there will be a benefit out in the future. I see the trends, and I don't know where the tipping point is, but it will be, good strategy to be working on, how to deliver that in, 3, 4, 5 years from now. And then on the manufacturing side, I mean, again, it's about clean supply chains. It's about knowing where your inputs are coming from. It's about energy transition. I mean, there's so many things they need to be doing. And then it's that willingness to share data and maybe even supply chains with your retailers. That's all new, right? I mean, manufacturers and retailers weren't necessarily friends in the past. And some of that has to be, set aside and think about, how do we ensure that the data is shared? Retailers have the data, they're able to share it as well in terms of the products that are in their stores, if they are, say a grocery retailer, et cetera. So, I think there's a lot more thinking about how to align systems, how to, be more integrated and be comfortable sharing, data on this dimension.
Interesting. Well, listen, great advice. And speaking of advice, where can folks go to get in touch if they want some more advice from you or the folks at EY? Are you a LinkedIn person? I know you to be a LinkedIn person, but where can they go get in touch and get more advice and find out more?
Yeah, I'm a LinkedIn person. I'm always posting, what I think is relevant myself on LinkedIn. So certainly go there. And EY.com, you should be able to find, a lot of our thinking, whether it's, under consumer or under consumer products or under a future consumer index. Hopefully those things pop up on EY.com.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, Kristina, thanks again so much for joining me on the mic. I always really enjoy our conversations. You provide such great data and then the insights that wrap around the data. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of your travels, and I wish you safe travels for the year 2024, and maybe we'll get back in touch as you continue to learn and we all continue to learn. So once again, thanks for making the time.
Absolutely. Delighted to.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure and check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global E-Commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor, Keynote Speaker, Rethink Retail 2023 Global Top Retail Influencer. If you want more content or to chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.